Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we'll be breaking down the process of how to draw an accurate female anatomical body that is proportionally correct. So the process with anatomy in terms of really understanding the proportions is the same for both male and female. However, there are ways in which to draw male and female body structures in different kinds of approaches, but the process is kind of the same for both male and females. So when it comes to the body is kind of basically broken up into these equal segments, and we can either define these segments by establishing a grid with 8 equal parts that kind of break up the body into these little bits that help us construct the different features and place them in their anatomically correct positions. Now, often with anatomically correct proportional body drawings, you want to establish a grid first, but there's another approach where we actually begin with the torso, this trapezoid torso shape or rectangular shape that is going to basically establish the torso. So we're actually going to work with two types of rectangles. So for one, we're going to make this elongated rectangle, which is going to establish the upper torso, which will define the shoulders to the navel area. And then we're going to actually work with this shorter square-like rectangular shape that will define the hip of the structure. So in terms of creating poses and positions, these two starting shapes are really the starting points in terms of how it's going to determine the position and pose of the structure. So we want to consider how this top triangular shape works as the torso, and then there's a pivoting action that connects to this smaller lower rectangular shape that will define the hips, and this is going to determine how the body moves into the hips and how that will later on establish curvature between the upper torso into the hips, and then obviously later on into the legs. Okay, now once we have these two shapes, what we're actually going to do is we're going to draw a line from the top rectangle directly through to the lower rectangle shape and all the way down. And basically this line, this vertical line, we can add curvature to it. Again, this is going to help establish the axis along which we will draw in the lower features of the body, such as the legs. What we can also do is we want to draw in this vertical line that runs parallel with the top line of the lower rectangular shape, and this is going to determine the two starting points of the legs, or the two points where the legs connect to the hip. So this will kind of establish the pelvic or pubic bone area, which will actually determine the overall shape of how the legs connect into the hips. Now, once we have this generalized vague shape drawing, what we're going to start doing is we're going to start actually creating these demarcated lines that will slowly determine how the body is broken up into these equal bits. So remember, the body can be broken up into 8 equal bits, or what we can do is we can use those shapes, the upper torso shape and the hip lower torso shape, as a starting point to determine where other features are placed. So between the top rectangular shape, the upper torso, and the lower rectangular shape, the hip, that middle gap is a point where we can actually visualize where the navel will be placed. Now, on top of the rectangular circle, we can also begin to draw in a circular shape that will determine the head. Below the lower rectangular shape, below the shape that determines the hip, we can make another mark, and that's actually going to determine where the pubic bone will be placed in the drawing. Now, the pubic bone is actually a point that breaks up the body into 2 equal parts. We can think of the pubic bone as the middle point, or the crotch bone as the middle point between the upper part of the body and then the lower features of the body. Now, below the pubic bone, we want to imagine 2 more lines that will basically determine the placement of the thighs and the starting point of the calves. Now again, this process is a little bit quicker than actually establishing all 8 segments to determine or accurately place all features perfectly. This is more an approach to give you a more loose and artistic sense of how to draw a figure without necessarily needing all the guidelines. What you can do is you can draw a line that defines where the kneecaps or the top of the calf would be placed, and the idea here is to kind of work more loosely and try to imagine the length of the legs. Now again, the way in which you use this quick method to establish accurate proportions is that the pelvic bone point just below the lower rectangle will half the body, or is the halfway point between the top features of the body and the lower features of the body. So for instance, if we have drawn now the torso and the hip bone and the head, that whole structure, all those top features have determined a measurement in length. Now that length can be the same length used to determine how long the legs will be, and that's how we kind of basically draw the body proportions quickly without needing to have these 8 equally segmented parts. Okay, now moving on. Once we have the upper torso established, what we're going to do is we're going to draw this arching shape to determine the rib cage, and this is going to help us establish the features such as the breast and the navel area and the rib cage within the torso. So the idea here is that we draw this arching shape from the lower part of the rectangle into the center of the rectangle, and then kind of arch back downward to establish this rib cage shape. What we then do is we kind of create this oval shape over that arch to the top of the rectangle to determine where the collarbone and the jugular notch would be placed. So from the jugular notch, that's where we can actually start drawing a line to determine the neck, as well as the shape and position or angle at which the head will be connected to the neck. Now from the jugular notch, moving to the 2 top corner points of that top rectangle that determines the upper torso, that's going to determine the shoulder points. Now this rectangle basically determines the shoulder points. The 2 top points of the rectangle will determine the points of the shoulder, and then the lower 2 points of the rectangle determine where the rib cage kind of ends. In the lower rectangle, what we're going to do is we're basically going to draw this upside down triangular shape that starts from the 2 top corner points of that lower rectangle shape. So that's going to determine the actual pelvic area, and that's slowly going to define how the hips are established. From there, we'll find that the triangular shape that is drawn within that lower rectangular shape is going to determine how the legs insert into the hip. So what we are basically doing here is we are defining the curvature in the hips, and how the hips connect to the thighs as well as the buttocks, and obviously this is going to add more or give more curvature or accentuate the hips, obviously to develop a more female structure. So we can also bring in the waist slightly, so we can narrow the waist a little more, and this is where we connect the lower rectangle to the upper rectangle with these vertical lines. However, we want to make sure that those vertical lines kind of arch inward towards the body, and this is going to accentuate the hips as the hips come outwards and then flow to the legs. Now as we continue with this drawing, we'll find that those lines from the outer hips from the lower rectangular shape can actually start flowing down to that horizontal line that we established, where the kneecaps will be determined within the female figure drawing. And this is where we start to see how the kneecap, or the lines that flow to the kneecaps, can also then continue and flow directly down to the last horizontal line, which will establish the end point where the feet will meet the ground. Now at this point, we should see this vague kind of mannequin-like anatomical structure, and what we can start doing is we can actually start working with our eraser and pencil in tandem with one another to start giving more curvature to the features. So again, we want to make sure that the upper torso area flows with these inward arching lines to the hips, and then they start to curve outward again to give more curvature to the hips or the buttocks area, or the waist, which is obviously synonymous with a more classical feminine or female structure, which then starts to flow inward again as these lines start to go down towards the knees. With the calf muscles as well, again, we want to consider how the calf muscles slightly protrude. So there'll be more curvature in the calf again, and then slowly narrowing once more towards the ankle and the feet of the female structure. And this is where we can actually start to be a little bit more playful. So all the way from those first two trapezoid or rectangular shapes, we have established the upper torso as well as the lower hip section, and how this is ultimately going to define the end result or pose at the end of the drawing, purely by how we position those two structures. We then obviously add in the upper torso features connected to the lower hip features, and then slowly use that upper torso, or rather all the features above the pelvic bone point, as a point of measurement that will determine the length of the legs. And the reason again is because the pelvic bone, that point, breaks up the body into two equal halves. Now, as we continue with drawing and sketching in the legs, again, we really want to consider how leg muscles look aesthetically on a female figure. And again, the hips are obviously quite wide, and they slowly start to narrow into the thighs until they get to the knee points, which they then again start to protrude slightly again as we flow into the calf muscles, and then they narrow to a point again once we get to the ankles and the feet. Now, from the shoulders, we can actually start forming the arms from the shoulders, and we want to really consider how the arms connect into the upper torso. So the arms tend to, the muscular formation flows from the arms into the breasts or into the chest area. The arms can also be broken up into two sections, and the way in which we determine the placement or the scale of those two sections is that the hands will end near the crotch or hip area, or the higher thigh area. So the hands will be drawn between the crotch and the upper thigh area. However, the middle point that breaks up the arm into two sections can be determined by the placement of the navel. So the navel can be used as a way to determine where the arm will be broken up into two sections. And that's where we can actually draw the bend or the elbow of the arm, using the navel as a means or a way of helping us understand where to determine that bend in the arm. Now, as we draw the breast, again, we want to make sure that we consider how the upper arm and the muscles below the skin of the upper arms actually flow into the breast. Now, with women, we don't necessarily want to draw these circular structures because that is just unrealistic, and it's not necessarily how breasts actually are placed or form on the chest area. So we actually want to think of it as a teardrop shape, and this is because gravity kind of brings a slight more curvature to the lower breast area, but then they begin to become a little bit more flattened out near the upper section of the breast as it connects into the muscles of the body that flow from the armpits into the arms. So try to think of drawing the breast as these teardrop shapes that flow into the neck area, as well as into the armpits and armpit area of the structure. Now, once we have this generalized sketch, what we want to do is we want to actually slightly erase the drawing and move on to utilizing something a bit more stark, a bit more distinct, like a pen or a marker, where we now slowly go over all these features just to enhance their form and shape and define their shape a little bit more with some bolder lines. And this is a really great way to actually practice. A good suggestion would be to make a variety of these drawings where you actually start with those two trapezium or trapezoid or rectangular shapes in all different poses, giving yourself the challenge to draw female figures in a variety of different stances and poses. So utilizing your pen, what we want to do is we want to slowly work through our drawing and the different features of the body, really trying to enhance the characteristics that are unique to the features of a female figure. And this is where we start to accentuate the hips, making sure that we are drawing in the navel, making sure that we're also kind of using some line work to establish the slight protrusion from the navel all the way to the pubic bone. We also want to start using some line work to define the thigh muscles and how the muscles flow from the knee all the way into the pubic area. We also want to use line work to establish and refine the hips and how the hips connect into the upper torso, as well as the teardrop shape of the breast and how they rest on the chest. We can also start kind of adding that curvature and form to the shoulders and how the bicep muscle kind of flows into the elbow, how the elbow curves and becomes more narrow as it comes to the hand. But this is the general process of how to draw the female figure. It's really about building it up from shape and then using these measurement rules of torso sizes and scales to determine the rest of the size and measurement of the other features of the body. Again, a major takeaway here is to remember that the pubic or crotch area is going to determine the halfway point between the upper features of the body and the lower features of the body. So how long the legs should be and how long the upper torso should be. And this is a really great way to draw figures fast without necessarily needing to segment the body into 8 equal parts. So working with this method of using shapes to define the upper torso and lower torso, or the hip area, and then using that to kind of draw in the head, and then using that overall upper set of features to determine how long the lower set of features should be, or the legs, is a great way to actually draw characters really fast. Once you understand that top rectangular shape can be used to determine the rib cage, and that lower rectangular shape, that smaller rectangular shape, can be used to determine the hips, you can actually draw a variety of figures in all sorts of poses, and it will help you determine the measurement and scale in an accurate, proportional way for a female figure drawing. But yeah, I hope this was helpful. This is one method of drawing a female figure. There we have a variety of videos that actually explore anatomical drawings and how they are compared, how the female body is compared to the male body, and how to work out these proportions in a more detailed way. But otherwise, that is it. The major takeaway over here is to really remember that the body is broken up into equal parts, and we can actually use features to determine the placement of other features, such as the navel, determining where the elbows will be placed, or how the upper half of the body is broken into 2 equal parts, which is determined by the placement of the pelvic bone, and that will help us establish how long the legs should be as well. Otherwise, that is it from my side, guys. I hope this was really helpful. I hope this tutorial gives you insights on how to draw female figures a little bit faster and a little more loosely. This particular method is really helpful when you want to draw figures accurately, and just do it without necessarily needing to be too precise with proportions. Once you have the general and overall understanding of placement of features and how the body is broken up into these 2 equal parts, you basically have the tools and the skill set to draw bodies in an accurate and proportional way. But otherwise, if this was helpful, please like and subscribe. That helps us. We really will be making a lot of content that focuses on anatomy and breaking down the process of drawing bodies and structures, and focusing on features more specifically. But otherwise, that's it, guys. Thanks, and see you in the next video. Cheers.